They asked me to sort of give a global perspective and talk about petroleum and petroleum products. This is a very sort of macro view of the markets, which is something that we don't always do. We do a lot of project work and very sort of micro issues, but it's something that we do have some experience in and pay a lot of attention to be sure. ESAI, just a few words on us in case you're not familiar with what ESAI does, is a consultancy based in the Boston area. It's independent as well, so we don't have to listen. We can sort of say whatever we want, which is kind of one of the things that we sort of pride ourselves on. We take a very bottom-up approach to markets. We gather data from all over the world, every country in the world, and we do most of our work from a global model of liquid fuels that's begins at the well and through the refining sector and all the way to the different pieces of the demand side of the market. This is just an outline of what I'm going to talk about today. Basically, what I'd like to do is kind of present sort of a global picture of the petroleum market and to some degree petroleum products, and talk about supply, but also dig down a little bit into our demand forecast through in the period through 2020, and then sort of place some of the larger producers in Latin America in that context, sort of towards the end of the presentation. So this is actually one of our publications. It's the front page from one of our publications, and I put it up here because of the date, which is July of 2013, and also the content, which basically sort of talks about this decision that would be forced on OPEC by the increase in production from U.S. shale. And that OPEC would need to make a decision at some point, either to cut back their production and support prices, or fight for market share from the U.S. and other non-OPEC producers, and therefore suffer lower crude prices. And the reason I have this up here is because when the price fell in November 2014, that's not the day that markets became oversupplied, right? I mean, this process of oversupply in the global crude oil market was actually happening for a long time, kind of leading up to the price correction, and actually probably should have fallen before it did in, I guess, about a year ago in November 2014, were it not for some major disruptions in Libya that kind of supported the global market for a while. So this is just sort of a numerical representation of that process. I'll just point you specifically to the final 2 years of this chart. This is cumulative growth in the left column, in the green column, the growth of global demand. So that's total oil demand growth. And then on the right, in the blue bar, is the growth in cumulative growth of non-OPEC supply. So you can see how non-OPEC producers in a high-price environment were exceeding the demand growth in the world and really cutting into OPEC's position. And you see the price adjustment in the Brent benchmark in 2014 and especially in 2015. So that's just a bit of background to kind of set up more of a discussion of where we are right now and where we're headed in the period to 2020. So in terms of market fundamentals, I think it's been pretty clear. If you look at the upper right-hand chart here, in 2015, there's been a very significant bounce in demand. We're projecting about 2 million barrels a day of demand growth, oil demand growth globally this year, and that slows down in 2016, but it's still pretty significant, about 1.5 million barrels a day. So that's kind of one way that the market is correcting itself to some degree. The other thing is the drop that we see in the growth of non-OPEC supply, right, which is the sort of lower right-hand chart, lower left-hand chart here. The U.S. shale is certainly leading this in 2015 and leading sort of that non-OPEC supply growth to turn negative in 2016. But it's also a North American phenomenon in a lot of ways because we're seeing some major declines in Mexico and some stagnation in Canadian production. And I would also say in 2016, we expect other regions, among them Latin America, the FSU, to sort of basically for supply growth to stagnate as a result of this lower price environment. Another sort of piece of kind of where we are now is the pressure that we're seeing occur in terms of the pressure on OPEC countries. I sort of split them up into two groups here. The blue countries on the left is where we're seeing a lot of problems in terms of economics, in terms of the financial position of both the countries and the state-run or state-owned oil companies. And then the countries in red, where really geopolitics and sort of some of the conflict in the Middle East is I would say a more important factor than sort of any sort of economic issues as a result of the fall in the price of oil. So I just point this out because when we think about how does the market move from here, right, and where are we headed, you know, we don't forecast disruptions in crude supply. We don't say that such and such crude supply is going to be shut in a given month. That's not something that is even possible. So what we do look at is we consider the possibility of supply disruptions, and you know, certainly in some of those very oil-dependent countries, we're paying a lot of attention to any correction, any disruption in crude supply, where if you have some production shut in, say 500,000 barrels a day or 1 million barrels a day of production, you can quickly get the price to move higher, right, to $80, say, to $90 in a matter of a couple weeks if there is a major supply disruption. So that's sort of, you know, always in the back of our minds, but we're also looking at fundamentals and what happens if those supply disruptions don't occur. How does the market correct itself from the major shock that it was affected by a year ago? And I think our view on this in the period to 2020 is that the market corrects fairly slowly, in our view. And I'll go through sort of what we expect to happen or what we forecast will happen in terms of global fundamentals over the next 5 years in the absence of a major supply disruption. And just a few bullets here to kind of set it up. You know, we've certainly already seen some changes in investment strategies. We've seen some changes in corporate strategies. We think as the oil price remains low, certainly this year and into next year, those companies operating in non-conventional resources, those companies that have very high costs of production, those companies that are very highly leveraged, come under increasing pressure either to shut in production or also they become a threat of either a bailout, perhaps, or a purchase by another company and consolidation of their production. So that's certainly one way that the market can sort of rebalance itself from the supply side in a low oil price environment. So we do think that some of this sort of begins to happen this year and next year. And the biggest correction that we see happening is in U.S. shale. But, you know, this chart's actually a little boring because there's a lot of offsetting things happening in terms of non-OPEC production. But I think you can see sort of from the line and even from sort of the OECD production that we expect non-OPEC supply to fall considerably next year, but then to recover, but only moderately in the period to 2020. So this has to do certainly with what we're seeing in terms of the supply side and the corporate side. And I would say that it's most acutely felt in U.S. shale. So here is our, I guess, historical production and forecast of output from U.S. shale resources in each of the shale basins in the U.S. And you can see clearly the extraordinary growth through 2015 by about 4 million barrels a day of production in a 5-year period. And we think that falls off considerably in 2016. In fact, it's already pretty much stagnated and a lot of wells are being shut in. But we think that sort of returns to some very, very moderate growth going forward to 2020. Before the oil price crash, we actually predicted the peak of the shale production to be in about 2018, 2019. But now, given the sort of correction that we're seeing, we actually expect the increases to be more moderate, but to continue into the next decade because they're the resources that are available. So what you have here is really one of the global swing producers that has emerged as a result of these increases in non-OPEC production in the recent past. And really, it's isolated in two areas. If you look at this green piece of these bars and the red piece, it really is the Bakken in North Dakota and the Eagle Ford Formation in Texas that are really the swing producers here, where you'll have the flexibility to turn on and off based on the economics of that production. And that will serve as a source of stability in the global oil market going forward. So I talked a good amount about supply here, but I think, in terms of our view of fundamentals kind of tightening very moderately in the forecast period to 2020, it's certainly about supply, but it has a lot to do with our view on demand, which I think, you can see from this chart, we expect demand growth to be fairly moderate in the period to 2020. And I'll go through just sort of a number of reasons of why we think that is. Key to this is the slowdown in gasoline demand growth, led in a lot of ways by the US, but also the other OECD countries, and I think broader kind of efficiency gains that we've kind of talked about over the last few days in some of these other sessions, beginning to have an impact on gasoline demand globally. With that, we think diesel demand growth will pretty much stagnate in the period to 2020. So you have this kind of correction happening or I guess moderation happening in the demand for transportation fuels, or the growth in the demand for transportation fuels. But if you look at some of these petrochemical demand pieces like LPG and naphtha, we actually think that the demand for those products will be quite strong through the end of the decade, and actually the petrochemical sector will begin to consume a greater percentage, right, of oil demand growth in the future. So this is just one piece of some of the things we've been looking at in terms of efficiency gains in gasoline consumption. So this is U.S. The sort of average, the fleet fuel efficiency, basically, of the U.S. Automobile fleet, the light-duty automobile fleet, like cars and light trucks. This is the CAFE policy, it's called. Basically, what this policy does is it mandates that car manufacturers in the U.S., not just U.S. car manufacturers, but any car manufacturer that is selling automobiles in the U.S., has to sell a new car fleet with an average fuel efficiency at a certain level. And that number is increasing in the period to 2025 each year. So basically, the new cars that enter the U.S. fleet are more efficient each year. And this policy increases the fuel efficiency to about 52.5 miles per gallon by 2025, which is about, I think, 22 kilometers per liter. So that's a big shift from where things are right now. But it takes time for those new cars to be sort of introduced into the fleet, right? So there's a transition that happens. The whole fleet recycles about every, say, 15 to 16 years. So it takes time to see those efficiency gains in the entire fleet of automobiles. Nevertheless, even just this movement from 22.5 miles per gallon to, say, 24.5 miles per gallon in the period 2016 to 2020 is a huge impact on gasoline demand growth in the U.S. So these efficiencies are beginning to take effect in the forecast period, and even more so after 2020. And I'll just add to that there's other policies that are happening not in the U.S., certainly led by OECD countries. There was Mr. Kim on, I guess, Wednesday was talking about a lot of the steps that Korea is taking to curb some of its consumption of transportation fuels, and we're seeing this in a number of large emerging markets as well. So gasoline demand growth is not going away, but it is changing and moderating in our view. This is sort of another way to look at global demand growth from a regional perspective, and I think what we're seeing here from a regional perspective is certainly a change in North America's growth. A lot of that linked to gasoline demand policy, but also a change in Asian demand growth, and even the results of that change in Asian demand growth in terms of its pull on global commodities and how that is also affecting demand growth for certain transportation fuels in commodities-dependent countries. So essentially what I'm trying to say is that this sort of super cycle, as it's often called, from say the decade through 2013, that really led global demand growth to kind of explode in a lot of ways, and was a lot of the reason for why oil was over $100 per barrel for a significant amount of time. We don't necessarily see that coming back to that in that extreme way, and a lot of that has to do with I think our view, which is not sort of a very radical view that demand growth in China is slowing. So this is a chart of I guess historical and our forecast for Chinese GDP growth, which is the line, and also the growth of these three major transportation fuels. So you can see that this process sort of China's transition economically from an extreme focus on infrastructure and industrialization to something more service sector oriented, more consumer oriented economy is in fact began impacting diesel consumption really in 2011, 2012, right? So if you look at the red bars here, you can see how much diesel demand growth has sort of fallen off from the Chinese economy, whereas gasoline has been quite strong. But the reason that we have this transition in gasoline demand growth to slower growth in China is additional sort of policy-driven change in China, where essentially they're limiting the expansion of the car fleet by limiting the sale of new cars in China. I think we've all seen photos of congested highways and really bad sort of pollution in some most major Chinese cities. One of the government policies in order to kind of try and I guess catch up infrastructure-wise with the growth of the automobile fleet is to place limits on the sale of new cars. And so this is another sort of significant driver of our global demand view for oil overall. And just to kind of sum up here, I think that certainly supply matters. And supply has been, I think, a major issue behind a lot of the change that we've seen in global crude markets over the last year, of course. But really underlying, I think, our moderate view of the tightening of fundamentals going forward is really the result of our view on global demand growth. So what does this mean for prices? It means that there's certainly been an equilibrium that's been found in the market in sort of the neighborhood of $50, $55. We think that prices will increase beginning in 2017 especially, but moderately through 2020. We don't think we're going back on an annual basis to $100 per barrel anytime soon based on what we see happening in the market. And I think a lot of that has to do with our view on global demand. So that's sort of the first half of my talk in terms of kind of setting up kind of a global picture and talking a little bit about the global environment that we see right now. So in trying to think about how I could sort of add to the discussion and think about the implications for Latin America, I think there's some experts talking about Peru later on, so I'll stay away from that, but I'll look a little more closely at some of the major producers in the region. But the first thing I'll do is talk about some of the things we've been looking at to try and forecast supply in Latin America and other places in a low price and highly competitive market, right? So how can we determine when demand is limited where supply should come from? So I'll go through a couple of those factors. And I think underlying this is because of our sort of view on demand is really an emphasis on understanding the limits of supply growth in such an environment, and planning for that environment in sort of the medium term. So the first factor that we've been paying a lot of attention to is crude quality, right? So this is basically a chart that's cumulative growth in the demand for different types of crude oil, right? And the way we get to this is through a look at every refinery project in the world and how it's configured and which crude oils it's configured to run and which products it wants to produce, right? So we can see, and we can, there is some, I guess the forecasting happens when we think about the timing of these projects, right? Which is always sort of the most difficult part of forecasting refinery expansion or refinery closures. But based on our view of the projects that are underway and the timelines for those projects to be completed, this is sort of what we expect in terms of the additional capacity by the global refining sector to consume these different types of crude. One thing I think that's notable from this is the growth in the ability for the global refining sector to process condensate, which is the very top bar here, which I think is potentially helpful or useful for the Peruvian case, because there is condensate production potential here for sure. We're seeing a lot of that, a lot of condensate splitters, and also being built, and also a lot of refineries that run lighter crudes that can spike their crude with condensate. The other piece of this is the growth of medium as sort of an important crude for the global market, sort of this orange bar in the middle. Places like Brazil where the pre-salt is of a medium quality will find a market, a growing market to sell into. That sort of contrasts with the heavier crudes, which is sort of the gray on the bottom, where if you kind of push this graph back, say the decade before 2014, you would see that the heavy piece was probably the largest. And we're seeing a lot of investment move away from the additional processing of heavy crudes. For a number of reasons, certainly there's more light crude and condensate available in the market, but also we're seeing the product markets change as well. So this chart, basically what this shows is that different crudes have different products inside of them, right? So when you process a different variety of crude, you get a different slate of products. When you're processing those lighter crudes or even those medium crudes, you're getting more petrochemical feedstock, which could be useful if there's more demand for petrochemical feedstock. Whereas if diesel demand isn't growing the way that it was, you don't necessarily need a complex refinery to be running a lot of heavy crude if diesel demand isn't, if in fact right now the diesel market is very oversupplied. So basically what we've done with this sort of product value piece of this analysis is to try and figure out the value of a crude rather than the price of a crude. So if you look at how much each product, if you take a quality of crude, you run it through a specific refinery in a specific place, you get a specific product output, and you can price that output and then find the net back to get to the value of that crude in the market rather than just the price of that crude, right? So what's the growth product worth, the GPW, of a given crude? And that really helps us determine which crude oils are most competitive in an extremely competitive market, right? And it has a relationship, I think, with the previous chart on the different types of processing capacities that will be available. I just put this up here to kind of disaggregate a little bit that sort of global chart on changes in refining capacity to show that there's considerable diversity within regions and certainly within countries in terms of the type of expansion we're seeing in the refining sector. So you can see the degree to which condensate production in the U.S. and North America is changing, and also the sort of character of the declines in processing capacity in Europe, I think, is another sort of important piece of this analysis. A final sort of factor we've looked at is costs. I mean, costs obviously always matter, but right now they matter more because they're not just determining the profitability of a crude, they're determining whether a crude production in a certain field or in a certain country is viable and profitable. So we're paying a lot of attention first to production costs, but also to a lot of the regulatory costs that are sort of based on different policies and the contract terms that are a result of a certain policy regime in a given country, or even in a given sort of region in some cases. And I think we're seeing some relaxation of some of those terms as a result of the competition that's happening right now for limited investment in a number of resources. So this is a sort of simple schematic of three important growth areas that we see in Latin America, and just kind of taking those different variables that we're looking at and just kind of noting where we think certain resources are competitive and perhaps not competitive. From the Argentine shale, from the Brazilian pre-salt, you have a crude quality that is very, very high. So that's an advantage to those resources for sure. In the case of the pre-salt, also the products are quite competitive. A lot of that has to do with the sulfur content of the Brazilian crude, which can be quite low. So it's a medium. A lot of the stuff from the pre-salt is medium, but it's also quite sweet. So you don't have to expend as much to extract the sulfur from the crude, which can make the crude more attractive in the global market. The problem with Brazilian production, though, is it's extremely expensive. It's an engineering marvel, the stuff that they're doing in the pre-salt in Brazil, but it is extremely expensive. And in that sense, it's less competitive. Whereas production costs in Mexico and Venezuela are traditionally much lower. And in Mexico, I think an additional advantage is its close market access to the U.S. Gulf Coast, and its, we think, increased integration with the U.S. As a result of the reforms in Mexico and also some changes that are happening in the U.S. Crude market as well. Just some evidence of that is the recent swaps agreement that was signed between the two countries. So I don't have a ton of time to go through each of these basins. I don't know that that's really necessary either, but just in terms of kind of what we're seeing in the market and in some of these larger resources in Latin America, we do think that Brazilian production is going to continue to increase. There's a lot of investment that's been already made in some of these large offshore platforms. These are 4 of them that I've listed here that are slated to come online this year and next year. And down below is just 3 of the fields that with significant potential that are kind of next up in terms of Petrobras's investment plans. We think that development in Brazil is definitely going to slow, but we think that because the scale of it is so large and the timelines are so long, we expect production increases to continue despite the low price environment. And you can't just shut off those units the way you can in, say, U.S. shale. The problem with, of course, the pre-salt is Brazil's debt burden, which is significant, and that's why I think we have a moderate view of Brazilian growth, certainly compared to, say, what Petrobras is forecasting And I think some of the strike issues that we're seeing in Brazil right now are evidence of some of the tension that's happening between different voices in the Brazilian petroleum sector. For the Venezuelan case, we're focusing most of our attention on the Orinoco, of course, in terms of growth areas, and in particular those areas where there's been the most interest by Indian companies, Russian companies, and Chinese companies, because there's financing agreements among the governments and among companies associated with those areas. So I just pointed out two here, Pedro Miranda y Pedro Carabobo, that have Russian and Indian interests in them, where we see the most potential for growth, right? And there's about 6 or 7 of these new Orinoco blocks that are currently under development. In terms of Mexico, it's really about timing and about the pace of investment. There's been mixed results in terms of the round 1 investments post the reform, but I think the actual interest in Mexico is quite strong. And they're still getting bidders and signing agreements in a very difficult environment in terms of the amount of capital that's available for investment by sort of foreign companies that might participate in some of these bidding rounds. So essentially our sort of view on it is that this is going to occur slowly, but that we do think Mexico is very competitive in terms of its oil sector relative to other places. So this is kind of some outcome of a bunch of that analysis. It just shows, I guess, our view of production, of changes in production in the next 5 years versus changes in production in the last 5 years. I think the biggest shift is probably Mexico, because you'll start to see basically more of a flat production in Mexico versus some really significant declines in the past 5 years and even in the past decade. We think that declines will continue for the next few years, but by the end of this period, by 2019, 2020, you're going to start seeing some of the results of additional investment by sort of foreign players in the Mexican oil sector. I think this compares with, say, the Venezuelan case or the Ecuadorian case, or especially the Colombian case, where the reserve limit in Colombia is in our view going to lead to some declines in Colombian production in the second half of the decade, whereas it's really been the place that saw probably the most growth in Latin America in terms of production in the past 5 years, or I guess the past 10 years. And then the Brazilian case, as I said, we expect production to slow somewhat, production growth to slow somewhat, but to continue. So I just have a few minutes left. That's basically sort of the gist of how we see things kind of playing out over the next 5 years. Obviously, all in the absence of a major supply disruption, which is always possible, but which is not something that we can predict by any means. I was trying to think of just sort of how I might, again, contribute to the discussion during this event, and I thought to also look a little bit at demand really quickly in terms of Latin American demand. Certainly there's been a major decline in demand growth in Latin America for refined petroleum products. Certainly we expect a recovery. We don't, like I said, expect a recovery to the degree that we saw in the previous 5 years. A lot of this has to do with Brazil, but certainly other economies as well that I think were experienced such strong economic growth in the 10 years to 2013, that things will moderate a bit going forward. And in terms of Peru, it's really what we've been seeing in a lot of kind of net oil importers is what they're doing in this low price environment is they're buying and they're storing crude and products. So I think again, Mr. Kim the other day was talking about Korea's plans to increase their storage capacity, to buy additional crude and products in a low-price environment. And this is certainly an opportunity for any net oil importer to increase their strategic reserves and to increase their capacity to store or to buy capacity, storage capacity, anywhere, really. We're seeing this all over Asia. We're seeing this in the U.S., and we're seeing this in Europe as well. So these are my conclusions. I'm out of time here, but they're basically, I think you're probably familiar with what they are right now. We think that there'll be a slow tightening of fundamentals going forward. We think some of this has to do with supply, but a lot of it has to do with our view of moderate demand growth from a global perspective going forward. Just one additional note on the petrochemical feedstocks, which we think are going to be an increasingly important piece of global demand and can be satisfied not only by crude oil, but by NGLs and by the processing of condensate. And finally, just the conclusion in terms of Peru, we think that there is an opportunity for a net oil importer like Peru to take advantage of low prices. And we think that that's possible in terms of storage and strategic reserves. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Galante.